just one presentation. So the first thing we're going to talk about are those vessels that come off of the aorta as unpaired structures. Now you can see in this picture over here, here's the diaphragm, and of course they don't have most of it showing through, and you can see of course that you have the aorta that is peeking out from underneath the diaphragm, and you have all of these vessels coming off of it. Now what we mean by unpaired versus paired, those things that are unpaired do not have a left or a right. So if you look in this picture, you'll see here that there's a celiac trunk, a superior mesenteric, and an inferior mesenteric. Over here, this is my celiac trunk, this is my superior mesenteric, and this here is my inferior mesenteric. And neither one of those has a left or a right. It's just simply a single structure arising from the aorta. Why is that important? Well, because the veins that drain those organs supplied by those arteries go back a different pathway than the veins that drain organs supplied by paired structures. So let's just talk in general first about what the unpaired arteries are going to actually supply. So unpaired arteries are essentially going to be supplying digestive organs, and then anything that has to do with digestion are going to be supplied by that. So for example, the stomach, the small and the large intestines, associated structures with digestion like the pancreas, the liver, etc. So anything that has to do directly with digestion, or as an accessory digestive organ, is basically going to be supplied by a branch off of one of these three unpaired arteries. So for the most part, the celiac trunk is going to be the most complicated. The superior mesenteric supplies small intestine and most of the large intestine. The inferior mesenteric essentially takes over, supplying that part of the large intestine towards the end. It's the celiac trunk that supplies essentially everything else. It's going to supply the stomach and the spleen and the pancreas and the liver and the duodenum, the very first part of the small intestine. Now, so these unpaired arteries are going to be supplying those digestive organs. Now, what about the veins that are actually draining those organs? Well, here's the trick. They are going to go back through what we refer to as the portal system. And the portal system is essentially going to be that blood that goes through the liver. And so what happens is the veins draining these organs are going to carry that blood to the liver first for it to be processed. So the whole point of absorbing these things from the digestive system is to be able to store the nutrients, to be able to process any toxins that you may have ingested, that type of thing. Anything that needs to be taken care of in the liver is going to go back through the portal system. So that's associated with these unpaired arteries. So once it goes through the liver and gets processed in the liver and goes through the portal system, then it's going to go into the IVC. So that is a really important thing to note, that organs supplied by unpaired arteries off of the aorta basically are going to have their blood go back through venous drainage, back through the portal system first. If we go on to those paired arteries off of the aorta, that means that we have lefts or rights that come directly off of the aorta, and that is important, okay? So it's really important to remember that part of it, that they are directly off of the aorta. You have 6 pairs of those suckers to remember. Now keep in mind that you do have some lefts or rights that come off, for example, the celiac trunk. You have a left and a right gastric, or you have a left and right gastroepiploics. Those are not considered paired arteries because they do not come directly off of the aorta. So if you look in this picture here, you could see here would be a right inferior phrenic and a left inferior phrenic, and we have right and left suprarenals, right and left renals, etc., etc. So you have 6 pairs of these bad boys, and we're going to talk about those in more detail when we get to the paired artery slideshow. But the big picture thing to remember here is those are essentially supplying everything else that's really not part of the digestive system. So, for example, they would be supplying maybe the adrenal glands or the suprarenal glands that, of course, are an endocrine function. They would be supplying the kidneys. They would be supplying male and female genitalia. They would be supplying the diaphragm. So they're basically going to be supplying everything that doesn't have to do with digestion. So the important part here, so here's our paired arteries, and they are supplying these organs that essentially don't have to do with digestion, the stuff that doesn't need to be processed in the liver. Those are going to, of course, be drained by veins that go directly to the IVC. They do not go into the portal system. We do have one exception, as we always do. If we look at this sucker right here, this bad boy is called, I'm going to highlight it here, that is actually referred to, and you might have known this from lab already, a median sacral artery. Can also be referred to as middle sacral artery, and that's actually the terminal end of the embryonic aorta. Doesn't really have a huge function. It can supply some of the tissue in the area down there, but the exception is that this is actually an unpaired artery. There's no left or right for this. It comes directly off the aorta, or as you can see, it might actually come off just a little to the left or the right and come off of one of those common iliacs. The exception is that since it's an unpaired artery, you would assume that the vein that drains these areas supplied by that artery would go back through the portal system, when in fact they do not. The vein, the median or middle sacral vein, actually goes directly into the IVC, similar to what a paired artery would do. So that's kind of our one exception. We already finished talking about this kind of anterior section of our internal iliac. Now we're going to talk about this bit back here, which is really the posterior division. So let's talk about that. Excuse me. Superior gluteal is the big one that comes off of the posterior division, and you guys have probably seen that sucker in lab. You can just kind of, let me show you here. This big bad honking thing is going to be our superior gluteal. Essentially, it's almost like it's the entire posterior division, it seems, right? But really, this would be the posterior division of our internal iliac, right? And then once these other things come off, then the rest would really be called our superior gluteal. So that, denoted by the arrows, our superior gluteal. We already know what that supplies from Unit 1. Iliolumbar is the second one that comes off, and that is going to be that sucker right there. And you will oftentimes have two branches to your iliolumbar. You will have an iliac branch and you will have a lumbar branch. Of course, going to the iliacus muscle, the iliac branch, and the lumbar branch supplying the psoas or the quadratus lumborum muscle. Okay, so if we work our way down this posterior division, there is my iliolumbar coming off. We work our way down. The next one that comes off is that sucker right there, and that is going to be our, let me draw an arrow for you, our lateral sacral. Okay, and the lateral sacral kind of denotes the direction kind of where it's going, and that's going to supply the erector spinae group of muscles. Let me just do that in so you guys don't have to try and remember. Erector spinae group, maybe the skin and tissues in the sacral area. Okay, that's apparently tissues. Learn how to spell. Okay, so you should be able to see those both in lab pretty easily, and you can see that there's actually multiple ones that come off of that. Sometimes those extra branches of that will come off separately on their own. They don't have to all come off of the lateral sacral. And then, of course, once that branch is off here, then the rest of this is going to be called superior glute, and it's pretty massive. Oftentimes you'll have the inferior glute again coming off in that region as well. So we have our next slide here. This is a pretty easy one. Median, this can also be called middle sacral. Okay, that's this bad boy right here. You have a middle or median sacral artery and vein. You can see that it comes off not directly at the little V where you have the common iliac. Oftentimes it'll come off more to the left of the common iliac artery and drain back in more to the left on that common iliac vein. So just keep that in mind. It's actually the caudal end of the embryonic the embryonic aorta. It's just kind of the end part of that. Doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot. Superior rectal artery, this is this sucker up here. As you guys can see, these big fat, I'm just going to abbreviate real easily there. There's my superior rectal. This is my middle rectal artery, and this is my inferior rectal artery. So the superior rectal is going to anastomose with the middle and the inferior rectal arteries. Now again, this is going to look a little weird because I already told you that this one here on that last slide was the middle rectal. It is. This would be our right middle rectal artery, and this would be our left middle rectal artery. They're just showing you two sides, and it's kind of split there, so it's a little bit funky. But these all anastomose with each other. If you guys remember, the rectum is highly, highly vascularized. An important thing to remember is that superior rectal, what does that bad boy arise from? Inferior mesenteric artery. These two, middle and inferior rectals, arise from the internal iliac itself, or the inferior rectal can come off the internal pudendal. Okay? So they're coming from at least two and sometimes three different sources. So again, superior rectal comes off inferior mesenteric artery, middle rectal comes off of internal iliac artery, and the inferior rectal can come off of internal iliac, but it often comes off of internal pudendal. Heck, sometimes it even comes off of the middle rectal, which is a little odd. But all three of those bad boys anastomose, supplying fantastic blood supply to the rectum. Last but not least, let's talk quickly about the veins of the pelvic cavity. Basically, you can see it's this major network of veins and their tributaries. It's this plexus of veins in the area. The internal and external iliac veins are going to basically both drain into, oops, let me get that out of there. Both of these bad boys drain into the common iliac vein, which of course you know, rather be right and left common iliac veins, and you know that that drains into IVC. Okay, so you can have most of the pelvic region is drained by this internal iliac and all of its tributaries. You can have some additional drainage via the superior rectal artery. Some can go back that way, that middle sacral, some can go back that way. So basically it doesn't have to be the internal iliac draining this whole region. You can, as we've seen with veins, pretty much any way it gets back is fine. It's just not a big deal. Last but not least, we have these plexuses that both males and females have, and then some that only males and only females have. If we start with the males first, we of course have a rectal venous plexus, a vesical venous plexus, and a prostatic venous plexus. So you have two venous plexuses there, and of course you know that vesical refers to bladder, so you can see the vesical venous plexus, of course, over here surrounding the bladder. There's the bladder in males. The prostatic venous plexus, of course, the prostate is under the bladder, so it's going to go there. And then you have this rectal plexus where you can see it would be draining the rectum. So you have that in males. Excuse me. In females, obviously you're also going to have a rectal plexus, and I don't remember if I have the picture for females. I don't think I may show it later on. So you got a rectal plexus, and you have a uterine plexus, a vaginal plexus, duh, because you don't have that in boys, but you also have a vesical plexus in females. So in males and females, rectal plexus and the vesical plexus are exactly the same. Men have the prostatic plexus, and then women have that plexus of veins around the uterine and the vagina, the uterus and the vagina. And you can see the plexuses here quite well. You can see just the amazing amount of venous drainage in that area. So the vesical venous plexus around the bladder and the prostatic plexus beneath that. In women, it's just really quite incredible, this venous plexus of this vestibular bulb here, and we'll talk about that when we get to that area. But you have, again, quite a bit of venous drainage in that area. And here's the picture of the female vesical plexus, just like you have in males. And then you have the uterine and the vaginal plexus that are unique to females. And that's it for arteries and veins in the internal iliac. I'm going to start with the unpaired arteries. If you are just now kind of looking at this, your best bet is to start with that file referred to as the big picture, so you get some idea kind of what I'm talking about before you look at unpaired arteries or paired arteries. So if you've already looked at that, now we're going to be talking about the unpaired arteries, and of course there's three main unpaired arteries that come off of the aorta, and that first one is our celiac trunk, and then we have our superior mesenteric artery, and then our inferior mesenteric artery. And you can see that the celiac trunk, as I mentioned in the big picture one, is going to take care of essentially everything from where the esophagus hits the stomach to the duodenum, including the spleen, the pancreas, and the liver. The superior mesenteric is essentially going to take over from the duodenum on down to probably about this part of the colon, and then from there the inferior mesenteric is going to take over and supply the rest of the colon and the rectum. What we're going to do is we're going to start by talking about the celiac trunk branches, and then talk about those other two. So what I decided to do was just kind of already put the words in here for you, pretty much just to kind of save some time, and that way you won't have to try and read my hateful handwriting. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to start with the three main branches that come off of the celiac trunk. And so I'm just going to kind of make a note here of my celiac trunk term. And of course we are talking about this area right here. Here's my celiac trunk, okay? So we have three main branches that come off of my celiac trunk. And I think what I'm first going to do is show you where they are on the picture, and then I'm just going to go ahead and kind of draw arrows to them on the words there. So the biggest branch off of the celiac trunk, the most Haas branch, is this sucker right here, and you can see it's kind of goes behind the stomach, so I'm going to draw it with a dashed line, and it's heading over to the spleen there. So that is going to be our splenic. That's the first branch, and that's a huge branch. The second branch you can see kind of comes off and supplies a little bit of the lower esophagus, and it supplies this lesser curvature of the stomach here. That's going to be our left gastric. And the third main branch of the celiac trunk is this one over here, which goes to the right, and that is going to be our common hepatic. So if we go ahead and just kind of draw arrows to that, there's my celiac trunk. So one main branch is going to be my splenic, another main branch is going to be my left gastric, and another main branch is going to be my common hepatic. What is super important when you guys are looking at these vessels, especially for these unpaired ones, is specifically not just what organ they're supplying, but what part of the organ they're supplying. So I just told you that the left gastric supplies this lesser curvature of the stomach, part of the cardiac region of the stomach, okay? So just keep that in mind. Don't just think of that it supplies the stomach. You need to know specifically where on the stomach it supplies. So we'll go ahead first and talk about those arteries that come off of the splenic. And for some reason I lost one of my words here, so I'll just go ahead and write it in. Should be a left gastroepiploic here. You might see this also referred to as gastroomental. Right or left. So that should have been typed in. I think I must have just erased it by mistake. So if you look at this picture here, you will see that there's my splenic, and then you have this branch coming off that kind of goes down and supplies the greater curvature of the stomach. So it is supplying the greater curvature here of the stomach, and that would be supplied by, at least partially supplied by my left gastroepiploic, which arises from my splenic. Now, if you look at the picture again, you will notice that the fundus of the stomach, if you remember from lecture, that's kind of called the fundus of the stomach, that is going to be supplied by my short gastric arteries. So we'll draw our arrow there, and if you look at the picture, you can kind of see these branches coming off of my splenic here, and they are going to be supplying the fundus region of the stomach. Those would be my short gastric arteries. So that's all you need to know as far as arteries that come off of the splenic, and of course the splenic comes off the celiac trunk. The left gastric is just left gastric. There's no branches that come off of that, or any more branches that you guys need to know other than it supplies the cardiac region of the stomach, the lesser curvature, etc. Keep in mind that sometimes in lab you might see one of those hepatic arteries actually arise from the left gastric. So that's kind of a common anomaly that we see in lab. So now we're going to go over to the third branch off of our celiac trunk, which is the common hepatic. And you guys know by now in class that anytime you see that word common, it means that we're either going to have a couple of things come together to form something, or in this case, it's going to branch into multiple things. And sure enough, our common hepatic is going to branch into two things. And if we look at our picture, here's our common hepatic. I've already drawn that in. And you see that it's going to branch this way and it's going to branch this way. This branch that kind of goes down is called our gastroduodenal. And as the name implies, that or branches off of it are going to supply the stomach, which is kind of what the gastro is referring to, or the duodenum, which is what the duodenal was referring to. Okay? The other branch off the common hepatic, of course, is that proper hepatic. And if it's in the name that sucker is going to be supplying the liver somehow, because we know that the word hepatic refers to liver. So if we look at the gastroduodenal first, we'll see what that thing is doing. If you look at the picture, you'll see that the gastroduodenal actually splits here into two main vessels that you need to know. This one that kind of goes over here, if you'll notice, it's supplying the pancreas, which we know what the pancreas is, and the duodenum. So the pancreas and the duodenum are going to be supplied by, you guessed it, the superior pancreatico-duodenal. It's in the name, pancreas, duodenum. Okay, we're going to come back to that superior in a second. Actually, if you read in your atlas, there actually is an anterior superior pancreatico-duodenal and a posterior superior pancreatico-duodenal. It is a mouthful. We're not going to require you to know the anterior and the posterior. Just know it is superior pancreatico-duodenal. So the other one coming off that gastroduodenal is this one right here, and if you follow it along, you see it goes along the greater curvature of the stomach, and that is going to be our right gastroepiploic. And it essentially does the same thing as the left gastroepiploic. The only difference is they arise from two different sources, and they have the same name. And so you guessed it. What are they going to do? They're going to anastomose. So I'm just going to kind of draw a squiggly line there to indicate that those two anastomose. And in fact, you can see that along the greater curvature of the stomach. They are going to anastomose with each other. Now let's go back up to our proper hepatic up here and see what that sucker's doing. Again, it's got hepatic in the name, so it's for the most part going to be supplying structures that have to do with the liver, but not always. All right, so our proper hepatic, as the name implies, is actually going to give off a branch before it gets to the liver. And so if we look at our picture here, you can see this branch. Here's our proper hepatic. You can see this branch right here coming off of the proper hepatic and going to supply the lesser curvature of the stomach. And, of course, the name of that is going to be my right gastric. So my right gastric artery arises from the proper hepatic, supplies the lesser curvature of the stomach. Now, we already have an artery that's supplying the lesser curvature of the stomach, our left gastric. And of course, since they're both of the same name and they're supplying the same region, you guessed it, they are going to anastomose with each other. So you guys can kind of draw in a little bit of a dashed line between the two. So the gastroepiploic supplying the greater curvature and the gastric supplying the lesser curvature of the stomach anastomose with each other. You add in the short gastrics, which supply the fundus of the stomach, and you've pretty much got the whole stomach covered as far as vasculature. Let's go back to the proper hepatic, and that is going to simply branch into left hepatic and right hepatic, and those you can see on the diagram here. There would be my sort of my left. You can't really see a left lobe there, and then that would be my right. You do have what's referred to as a middle hepatic in lab, which I think we have you require you to know or see if you can in the lab manual. I don't have you worry about that in lecture. Hepatic is hepatic. They're all going to the liver. So there's my right and my left hepatic, and if you can see from the picture here, we've got this little baby one here coming off of the right hepatic, and that is going to go to the gallbladder, and that one is going to be referred to as my cystic. So my cystic artery actually rises from my right hepatic artery. So that, my friends, is the blood flow for branches off of the celiac trunk. Yes, it is a lot, but if you just kind of get a few of the basics down, think about where those are going, then I think it shouldn't be too big of a deal. Now, before we move on from this picture, I just want to kind of note one thing. If you look at the picture itself, you will see that we've got this big old vessel. I don't know if you can see that. Let me get to a blue highlighter here. This vessel here that actually comes off, here's my celiac trunk. It's not very far below or beneath the celiac trunk. that superior mesenteric artery comes off. So that's what we're going to talk about next, is our superior mesenteric artery. Now again, I've kind of drawn or labeled the words here ahead of time just so I don't have to write all of those out. And what we're going to do is first start with our superior mesenteric here, and that is going to be shown, this sucker right here is going to be our superior mesenteric. Here's the celiac trunk just above it, so just to give you kind of an idea of where we're at. The bad thing about this picture is it doesn't show the small intestine, which is unfortunate because the superior mesenteric, the first few branches actually take care of the small intestine. But, you know, I guess because it kind of obscures the rest of the vasculature, they don't have it drawn in here, so we'll just kind of have to wing it. The very first branch off the the superior mesenteric, and it's not shown in this picture, is an inferior pancreatico-duodenal. And we've seen the superior pancreatico-duodenal here. It's one of our branches off the gastroduodenal. Okay, and of course the superior pancreatico-duodenal is going to supply the pancreas and the duodenum. The inferior pancreatico-duodenal is also going to supply the pancreas and the duodenum, just arising from a different source, superior mesenteric. And you guessed it, since they're both pancreatico-duodenal, they are going to anastomose with each other. So since I can't draw across slides, I'm just going to go ahead and remind you here that that's going to anastomose with our superior pancreatico-duodenal. And it actually provides some collateral circulation between branches of the celiac trunk and branches off the superior mesenteric. All right, so that's our very first branch that comes off. And I think what you will see is that essentially all we are going to do with these branches is go in the order of the GI tract. So, we've just supplied the duodenum via a branch off of the celiac trunk or the gastroduodenal, and here our first branch of our superior mesenteric. What is the next part of the small intestine that you come to? The jejunum. And in fact, that's going to be supplied by our jejunal arteries. Again, they're not going to be in this picture, but I suspect they would be kind of these little branches that are coming off the superior mesenteric right there. Then what's the next part in the path of the small intestine is going to be the ileum. So the ileum is going to be supplied with the ileal arteries. It is really just that simple. We're simply going in order of the GI tract. Now you'll see here that they do have kind of the last part of the small intestine here, the ileum, how it connects with the first part of our large intestine here, the cecum and the ascending colon. So this area here would be where the ileum meets the cecum. And therefore that artery that's going to be supplying that is going to be our ileocholic. So it supplies, here it is right here, it comes down, and you have some branches that are supplying the ileum, and you have some branches that are supplying the colon, and therefore it's called the ileocholic. It really is just that big. Again, working our way through the GI tract, the next part is going to be the ascending colon, and that's going to be this area over here, is going to be our ascending colon. So basically the arteries, that's the right side of the colon, so the arteries that supply that are just simply going to be called right colic. And if you look here, you can see this bad boy coming off. It's got some multiple branches here. That is going to be our right colic artery. If we work our way around even further, we get to the transverse part or the middle part of the colon, and therefore the last branches we have coming off of our superior mesenteric are going to be our middle colic, and they are going to essentially be supplying the transverse part of the colon, so that's going to be my middle colic arteries. I'll come back to that marginal artery that I bet you guys are wondering about in a second. So those are the branches off the superior mesenteric. They simply go in the order of the GI tract, starting from the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, colon, ileocholic area, right colic, middle colic. Okay, so when you're in lab, just look to see where the artery goes, and you'll know the name. Okay, the variation is going to happen where the arteries arise from, even though most of them do what they're supposed to. What you guys are going to be worried about is where that artery is going and what it's supplying. Okay, so the last unpaired branch we're going to talk about, it comes off the aorta much lower than the superior mesenteric and the celiac trunk, which are much higher up. And that's probably one of the first ones you cleaned out. That's the inferior mesenteric. Okay, and this one is going to essentially pick up where the branches of the superior mesenteric left off. So our middle colic is going to supply a lot of this transverse colon here. So about from here on down is going to be supplied by branches off of our inferior mesenteric. So we are in the descending part of the colon here, or the left side of the colon. So you guessed it, our first branch off of our inferior mesenteric is going to be our left colic. And you can see that we've got multiple branches coming off of that. If we get down here to this region of our colon, it gets that sigmoid shape to it. And of course, that's going to be supplied by our sigmoid arteries, which of course there are multiple branches off of that as well. And then in lab, you might only see one branch or two, but you can have multiple branches for these. And then finally, the inferior mesenteric, you can see it almost dive straight down in lab. That's going to be the superior rectal branch off of the inferior mesenteric. So there's only 3 branches off the inferior mesenteric. They basically start where the superior mesenteric branches leave off and end at the rectum. And there shouldn't be more to it than that. So there's really not too much difficulty with these, because all you have to think about is the order of the GI tract, and then just think about kind of what section you're in, and then that'll basically tell you what the name of the artery is. When we talk about the veins that actually drain these areas, in some cases you're going to be able to switch the arrows, as we often say. In some cases you're not. So I thought on this kind of last slide I would just kind of do a real quick, just a real quick way that you might consider learning this. Now you could sit there and do words and arrows. You could, for instance, just kind of put down celiac trunk and then say, okay, what are my 3 main branches off of that? Okay, I've got my left gastric, and then I have my splenic, and off of the splenic comes my short gastric and my left gastroepiploic, etc., etc. You could kind of go that way. I prefer to draw a picture, as you guys know, and again, the picture doesn't have to be pretty by any means. So if you were to do kind of a quick sketch of the aorta and your common iliac, and let's just kind of take the stomach. If you try and put too much on one sketch, it's just going to be this kind of nightmare of lines and such. So, you know, you can draw in your diaphragm if you want, and then I'm just going to kind of draw in a really, really poorly drawn stomach. Okay, you can label it. I'm going to draw a little spleen over here. It looks fabulous. Over here, I'm going to draw my liver with my gallbladder, just because that's fun, right? And then I'm going to just draw on here my branches off my celiac trunk. Okay, and if you do this a few times, I promise you, you'll get a really good idea of what these suckers are supplying and, you know, how they branch. It's all in the names. So my celiac trunk, we know that we've got 3 main branches off of that. The first branch, I'm going to draw a little dashed line because it goes behind the stomach, goes to my spleen. That's my splenic. And then I have that second branch that comes off. That's my left gastric. It goes to the lesser curvature of the stomach. And then my third branch that comes off is my common hepatic. So if you want to label them, have at it. Now, remember, left gastric doesn't have any other branches coming off it, so we're not going to do anything with that. Splenic, of course, you remember already because you guys are studs. That has my short gastric that comes off and supplies the fundus region. So that's my short gastric arteries. And it also has the left gastroepiploics that come off of the splenic and supply the greater curvature of the stomach. And that's it for the spleen, for the splenic artery. Now let's go over to the common hepatic. We know that that branches into 2 separate things, my proper hepatic and my gastroduodenal. So let's go ahead and draw in my gastroduodenal, and we're going to draw a dashed line because it goes behind all that. That is going to split into superior pancreaticoduodenal and right gastroepiploic. And where's that right gastroepiploic going to go? You guessed it, along the greater curvature of the stomach, and it's going to anastomose with the left. My superior pancreaticoduodenal, remember, is going to anastomose with that inferior one that comes off my superior mesenteric. Now let's go back up here to my proper hepatic. That one is going to branch into a left and a right hepatic. Okay? And off of that proper hepatic, before it branches, you are going to have a right gastric. And that is going to anastomose with my left gastric along the greater curvature of the stomach and supplying the greater curvature reason. Off of the right hepatic is going to be that cystic that supplies the gallbladder. And if I'm not mistaken, that is pretty much the branching pattern of arteries of your celiac trunk. You can do the same thing with the superior mesenteric or the inferior mesenteric, or you are welcome to sit there and just kind of do celiac trunk and draw left gastric, splenic. You can sit there and then short gastrics and, left gastroepiploics, and you can kind of do it that way. But I really think it's going to end up being like this kind of nebulous cloud of hatefulness that's just going to be mixed up in your brain. I really, really recommend you either kind of list it out in, kind of a nice outline style, or you draw it out kind of like I've done for you here, and do the rest of it that way. I really think not only will that help you visualize it, it'll help you remember what branches from what, and more importantly, it will help you remember what each of these branches is actually supplying. Okay, you guys, I know this looks a little busy with all the words and everything up here, but just bear with me, and I'll show you that the venous drainage of organs supplied by the unpaired arteries actually isn't as difficult as it may seem at first. Now, many of you have probably already drawn through these, worked ahead, which is fantastic. But what I'm going to do is start with the big picture first. I'm going to start with the big vessels that essentially form the portal vein, and then I will talk about what drains into those and what organs they drain and that kind of thing. So we're going to start with, of course, the splenic, the superior mesenteric, the inferior mesenteric, and then the portal. So if you look over here at the picture, you'll see that here is your splenic vein, and here is your superior mesenteric vein. Now, if you notice, the two of those suckers merge, come together, and form the portal. It's just that simple. Your inferior mesenteric is over here, and it is going to come up and flow into the splenic. So what you end up getting is this sort of chair of vasculature. I think your book refers to it the same way as a chair. And so if you were to draw in the arrows here, then you would have inferior mesenteric going into splenic, splenic going into portal, superior mesenteric going into portal. So both of those come together and form the portal. So that's pretty basic stuff. Shouldn't be anything that's rocking your world. Let me get rid of a few structures here so we can see better what we're doing. Okay. Now, so I don't have a bunch of busyness. I got rid of those. Let's start with the easy stuff. Now, it might help to actually have the unpaired arteries picture or the flow diagram next to you, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. If you remember, if we're talking about arteries, the inferior mesenteric artery gives off the left colic artery, the sigmoid artery, and the superior rectal artery. Well, it's really quite nice because you know how sometimes we can just switch the arrows, and in fact, in this case, we can just switch the arrows here. So our left colic, which is of course over here, so this is going to be our left colic area. Here's our sigmoid and then our superior rectal down there. Our left colic is going to drain into our inferior mesenteric. Our sigmoid vein is going to drain into our inferior mesenteric, and our superior rectal is going to drain into our inferior mesenteric. So those essentially you can just switch the arrows. If you look over here, you can see, of course, my left colic draining into that inferior mesenteric, my sigmoid's draining into the inferior mesenteric, and I believe, although it's hard to tell from this picture, that that one right there is my superior rectal, all draining into my inferior mesenteric. So those you can just kind of switch the arrows with the arteries. So that's pretty easy. And in fact, you can do the same thing with the branches of the superior mesenteric. If you recall, with the superior mesenteric arteries, those branches actually come off in order. So the very first branch that you have is the inferior pancreaticoduodenal, and then it essentially follows the GI tract. So then you have jejunal artery, ileocolic, right colic, middle colic. And with the veins that drain those same structures, so whatever the arteries supply, the veins are draining. So it's all in the name, of course. So the veins that drain those structures, you're going to be able to switch the arrows. It's really quite nice. So inferior pancreaticoduodenal is going to flow into my superior mesenteric. The jejunal is, of course, going to drain the jejunum. Ileal drains the ileum. Ileocolic drains the ileum and the first part of the colon, the cecum area. Right colic drains the ascending colon, and middle colic is going to be draining the transverse colon, and they all flow into the superior mesenteric. And you can see from this picture over here, you can see all of those here and how they are just essentially dumping right into our superior mesenteric vein. So those are the easy ones. You basically just switch the arrows from the arterial flow you have. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it when I talked about the unpaired arteries off the aorta. This appendicular vessel right here, the artery arises from my ileocholic artery. Makes sense because it's right there, and as you would expect, the vein is actually going to drain back into my ileocholic vein. So if you look over here on the picture, here is my appendix and my appendicular vein, and you can see it's just going to drain right back into my ileocholic vein. So that's pretty basic stuff. Again, just switch the arrows. That's kind of an easy one. Now, if we go up to those organs that are supplied by branches off the celiac trunk, that's where it gets a little hairy-carry. Sometimes you can switch the arrows, but a lot of times you can't because there simply aren't venous equivalents to some of the arteries we have. For example, the branches off your celiac trunk, you have three, if you recall: left gastric, splenic, and common hepatic. You got a left gastric artery, you have a left gastric vein. You have a splenic artery, you have a splenic vein. You have a common hepatic artery, you do not have a common hepatic vein. And the branches off the common hepatic artery do not coincide into veins either. No proper hepatic vein, no gastroduodenal vein. So that presents a problem. We can't just simply switch the arrows. So let's go ahead and start with the easy ones. If you recall with the splenic artery is going to, of course, supply the spleen. Splenic artery gives off short gastric, which supplies the fundus, and the left gastroepiploic artery, which supplies the greater curvature. Well, those veins, of course, are going to drain those same areas, and again, you can switch the arrows. So the short gastric vein and the left gastroepiploic vein are going to go right back into the splenic. The left gastric artery off of the celiac trunk supplies the greater curvature of the stomach, or excuse me, sorry about that, lesser curvature, and you can see it right here. So in this case, the left gastric, there's no celiac trunk vein. So what are we going to do with our left gastric since it comes directly off of the celiac trunk? Well, what happens is it's going to drain into the portal. And you can't really tell very well in this picture. It kind of has the left and right gastrics kind of as the same structure here. And in fact, as is the case with the arteries, the left and right gastric veins anastomose. So they can kind of then draw those together over here in that picture as them anastomosing. So the left gastric vein is going to drain into the portal, and the right gastric vein is going to drain into the portal. And you can see that in the picture here. They both just come over and drain into the portal. If we look at our right gastroepiploic, which the arterial equivalent would have come off the gastroduodenal, and you remember the right gastroepiploic is going to supply the greater curvature of the stomach, so the right gastroepiploic vein is going to drain that area. And if you look at the picture over here, you can see our right gastroepiploic vein and how it comes over, and it looks a little funky because you have this kind of weird loop-de-loop happening here, okay? But don't let that kind of get in your way. That right gastroepiploic is going to simply drain right into our superior mesenteric. If you follow it over here, here it is, and it's going to kind of loop around, and it's going to go right into our superior mesenteric. So that's pretty basic stuff. That's superior pancreaticoduodenal, which also arises from the gastroduodenal if we're talking about arteries. Again, since there's no gastroduodenal vein, you can't flow right back into it. That obviously is going to be draining the duodenum as well as the pancreas. Now here's kind of a tricky one. We actually, if you remember, I told you in lecture, you have on the online lecture, you have an anterior version of that and a posterior version of that. Now the veins for the anterior and posterior versions of the superior pancreaticoduodenal actually flow back into two different structures. One flows into the portal and one flows into the superior mesenteric. So I will actually take either for superior mesenteric drainage. You can either tell me it drains into superior mesenteric, for drainage of the superior pancreaticoduodenal. You can either tell me it drains into the superior mesenteric or it drains directly into the portal. Okay, I'll take either one of those. Perfectly fine. The last one to talk about is, of course, the cystic, and that's pretty basic. If you remember, the cystic artery comes off of our right hepatic artery, okay, but here the vein is actually going to, and if you look at the picture, it's pretty evident that that vein is going to just very quickly and easily go over into our portal vein. You can see that. It's right there. Why not? Sometimes actually the cystic vein can drain right up directly into the liver without going into the portal. And why not? It's right there, so it's, you know, not all that unheard of. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. And don't forget our anastomoses. They're exactly the same as the arteries. Right and left gastric veins anastomose, right and left gastroepiploic veins anastomose, and superior and inferior pancreaticoduodenal veins anastomose. And that should be about it for blood flow of your organs drained by those veins. Okay, so let's talk about the paired arteries off the aorta. I already mentioned the big picture for you, so we don't need to go into that now. We're just really going to talk about kind of the what's and the hows type of thing. These are really kind of self-explanatory. Like I said, there are essentially, I'd say 6 pairs, but some of these have multiple lefts and rights, so I don't want to kind of simplify it too much. We'll basically start from the top of the aorta and then kind of work our way down. So we have our drawing on the left, and over here on the right I've drawn in for you my version of the diaphragm, of course, and that's going to be this thing right there. And then I went ahead and drew in the aorta and kind of the common left and right iliacs, which we'll get to in a bit. I went ahead and drew in my version of the kidneys and the suprarenal glands, as you can see. So K for kidney and S for suprarenal gland. And then I also went ahead and drew in the ovaries and testes down here. I didn't clearly draw in the ovaries and testes, but I labeled them for you, just to give you some basics. Now, if you guys remember when we talked about innervation in the last unit, if you guys remember, the word phrenic refers to diaphragm. So it makes sense then that the inferior phrenics are basically going to be supplying the diaphragm. So those, in fact, are our first pairs that are going to come off the aorta, and you're going to have a left and a right inferior phrenic. So I'm just going to put IP here for inferior phrenic. You got left and your rights there, and that's pretty simple. That's pretty much it. Nothing more to worry about there. I'm going to actually skip down to our third pair for a minute. If you look over here, you can see that these are actually kind of, if you look on the picture, these are some of our largest paired arteries that we have coming off. They're pretty hoss. And those, of course, are going to be our renal arteries. And so we have a left and a right renal, because you know renal refers to kidney. So we have left and right renals coming off. And as I said, those suckers are pretty massive. So we're going to go ahead and make those a little bit thicker just because I feel like it. So if we jump back up to these organs right here, these, if you look at the picture, these little glandular looking things, these are endocrine in function. These are suprarenal glands, suprarenal above the kidney. And these really kind of have 3 paired vessels that are called suprarenal vessels. There's actually a superior suprarenal, a middle suprarenal, and an inferior suprarenal. So we're going to go ahead and label all 3 of those. So the easy ones first would be the middle suprarenal arteries, and those come directly off of the aorta. So that would be my right and my left. I'm just going to go ahead and put middle suprarenal, middle MSR. How about that? So we have a left and a right middle suprarenal. Those come directly off of the aorta. The superior suprarenals, left and right, those actually come off of my inferior phrenic. So we'll call that my superior suprarenal over there, and there's my superior suprarenal over here. And then of course the inferior suprarenals are going to arise from my kidneys. So there's my right inferior suprarenal and they're not going to rise from the kidneys, excuse me, they're going to rise from the renal arteries, and there is my inferior suprarenal on the left side. If you look over here at the picture, you kind of see what I'm talking about. So maybe I can try and erase some of those lines a little bit. There we go. Get rid of those. And if you look, this here would be our middle suprarenal. You can see it comes directly off of the aorta. And then our superior, these are our phrenics. And you can see we have our superior suprarenals coming off there. And then here are our renals, as I showed you earlier, and we have our inferior suprarenals coming off there. So it makes sense that if you have something that is popping out hormones, that it's going to be highly vascularized. And as a matter of fact, your suprarenal glands are highly vascularized, so they have a lot of blood going to them. We already talked about the right and the left renal arteries. We'll go ahead and label those. So the next ones we have on our list that you see are ovarian and testicular. And clearly that's kind of self-explanatory. So we'll just kind of go ahead and draw those in. They're obviously not going to bulge out like this. But sometimes these are referred to generally as gonadal. But basically, if you're female, you have the ovarian arteries. And if you're a male, you have the testicular arteries. So I'm just going to kind of label these as our OT arteries. So hopefully you guys are in lab, you can tell the difference between a male and a female and name them accordingly. So those are going to be supplying our ovaries and our testes. And then we have, the next one is going to be our lumbar arteries. And these are actually kind of self-explanatory too, but kind of like the suprarenals, you don't just have one pair of these bad boys. You actually have between 3 and 4 pairs. These come directly off of the aorta. They just shoot out kind of sideways. And they are going to be supplying the posterior body wall, muscles in the area, tissues in the area, part of the vertebral column. So they are going to be quite a few in number. So again, you're going to have 3 or 4 of those, and you'll probably see maybe 1 or 2 pairs of those in lab. And finally, kind of the last most obvious ones that you're going to see. Let me go ahead and just label those with L's so you remember that those are your lumbars. These are all your right and left lumbar arteries. And finally, the most common ones and the most obvious ones you're going to see are going to be the left and the right common iliacs. And we kind of touched upon those in previous units when we talked about external iliacs. So if you look over here on the picture, you will see that here is my right common iliac and my left common iliac. And if you remember, the common iliac is going to give off my external iliac, and here's my internal. We're going to talk about that, the internal iliac, in this unit. External iliac, we already know what that sucker does because we've talked about it in previous units. So that would be your paired arteries off the aorta. And remember, the super important thing about that is that the veins that drain these organs supplied by the paired arteries are going to go back directly into the IVC. So do not forget that. Keep that in mind. Okay, you guys, this should be quick and easy for you. If you haven't yet looked at the paired arteries off of the aorta, then you're going to want to look at that first before you talk about the veins that drain the organs supplied by those arteries, because this will make this a whole lot more sense, and it'll be a little easier for you. So we're going to go ahead and get started with just some of the basics, kind of the same template we have with the arteries here: suprarenal glands, kidneys, the diaphragm at the top, that dashed line, ovaries and testes. Instead of the aorta here, we have basically the IVC right down the middle here. Here's our IVC. And then, of course, left and right common iliacs. We're going to go ahead and start with some of the basics. I'm not going to write in the names of all of these because, again, if you've already done the arteries, then you have an idea. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with the right side, veins on the right side, because those are the easiest, and you'll see what I mean in a sec. So if we start with basically those veins that drain the diaphragm, those are going to be my inferior phrenic, and that's going to drain directly into the IVC. If we look here at my suprarenal vein, that's going to drain directly into the IVC on the right side. And if you guys remember with the arteries, you have a superior, a middle, and an inferior suprarenal artery. Here you just have a suprarenal vein, so it's actually much easier. The right renal vein that drains that kidney is going to drain directly into the IVC. Those lumbar veins on the right side are also going to drain directly into the IVC. There's actually another potential drainage for them. We'll come back to that in a sec. And then, of course, you have down here your right common iliac, which drains directly into the IVC. So the right side is really quite simple. Oh, I forgot one there. There's my, depending on if you have a boy or a girl, your right ovarian or your right testicular vein will drain directly into the IVC. So the right side's super easy. Everything drains just directly into the IVC. The left side has a few exceptions, of course. That's how it always works. Let's start out with the things that do what they're supposed to do. Of course, that left common iliac is going to do what it's supposed to do and just drain directly into the IVC. Those left lumbar veins will also drain directly into the IVC. Again, we'll come back to those in a sec. The left renal vein, as you probably have seen in lab, drains directly into the IVC on the left side. And the left inferior phrenic drains directly into the IVC on the left side. We're going to come back to that in a sec too. There's 2 or 3 on the left side that do something a little funky. As opposed to draining directly into the IVC, the left testicular or ovarian, obviously depending on if you have a boy or a girl, are going to drain into the left renal. The left suprarenal is going to drain into the left renal. So those do not drain directly into the IVC. They actually drain into the left renal. And then let's go back to that left inferior phrenic. Now remember, it can either drain directly into the IVC or it can come down and drain into the left renal vein. As a matter of fact, you see books that have it both ways, so who knows, you can probably have both things happening at once. I'm sure you can. Anything's possible. But those are 2 potential drainage patterns for the phrenic, the inferior phrenic on the left side. Now let's come back to what's happening here with these lumbars. If you remember from the last unit, we had these things called ascending lumbars. I'm going to go ahead and draw that in here. Make 2 big long veins here. And if you guys recall, those are our ascending lumbar veins. If you guys remember from the last unit, those bad boys on the right side would merge with the subcostal to form the azygous vein. On the left side would merge with the left subcostal to form the hemiazygous vein. Well, these actually provide some alternate pathways of drainage for this blood on draining this lower posterior wall, which is what the lumbar veins are draining. So if we look here, if we take blood in a lumbar vein here, we really have 2 choices. It can either just drain right on over into the IVC, just, you know, like normal, on either side, of course, or instead it can drain up into the ascending lumbar. So there are 2 possible drainages for those lumbar veins, either through the IVC or through the ascending lumbar. So it's a nice collateral circulation for that. And I think that should cover pretty much everything. Okay, you guys, we should be able to go pretty quickly through the branches of the internal iliac artery, mainly because you guys have already looked at this so much in lab. Kind of the problem with lab is that stuff never looks like how it's supposed to look. There's a ton of variation, as you've seen from this unit. So what I'm going to do here is talk to you mainly about the generalities about this. What's important is to kind of get the big picture, what these things are supplying, and then where they come off of is what's kind of highly variable here, so we won't have that be as important. So I believe you have this slide, the internal iliac slide, and how it supplies most of the pelvic viscera, musculoskeletal, gluteal regions. It divides into anterior and posterior divisions, and that's how we're going to divide it here. Now, these aren't named necessarily divisions. You wouldn't ever say something comes off the anterior internal iliac artery, but we do it kind of for organizational purposes, okay? So hopefully that will help you guys out as we go through this. So let's look here at some generalities first, and we can see that we have our aorta here, and here's the aorta and how it branches into left and right common iliacs, and of course that is going to branch right in this area into my external iliac and my internal iliac. So we are going to go into a little more detail of that branching and just go ahead and label these for you. This one is going to be my common iliac. Hopefully you don't mind if I do abbreviations. This is my external iliac, and we've already talked about that. That, of course, gives off the femoral artery, that gives off inferior epigastrix. That essentially gives off those things that supply the anterior abdominal wall, and we learned that in the last unit. So here is the internal iliac artery, and that's going to be the one that supplies all of the musculature and the skeletal and the tissue and the viscera, all of the organs in this pelvic region. So it's really quite important. This is the picture you guys have. It's kind of a super duper basic picture just to give you a general idea of the kind of things that we're looking at here. Basically, generalities of what comes off where, and we're going to go into a bit more detail on a picture here, and this picture here is out of Gilroy, so some of you may have seen this and some of you may not have. We're going to start with that anterior division. Now, as you can see here, the anterior division, if we're looking at big picture, that part of the internal iliac is what supplies all of the viscera in this region. So the bladder and the inferior part of the rectum, and if it's a female, the vagina and the uterus and that type of thing. The posterior division is going to supply the musculoskeletal stuff. Okay, so we're going to start with the anterior division. First thing you should notice here, let me do a little highlight here. So here's my internal iliac right here, and it's going to split into my anterior and my posterior division. So we are going to start with this umbilical artery, and that's essentially going to be our very first branch there. And you guys should know from lab that the umbilical artery actually degenerates, and let me go back here and show you. It degenerates, whoops, didn't mean to do that, into this medial umbilical ligament. So there's still part of the artery that actually works as an artery before it degenerates into that medial umbilical ligament. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So this can also be referred to as our medial, it's important that you remember that, umbilical ligament, and you guys remember that, and that can also be called the obliterated umbilical artery. Okay, so obliterated umbilical artery is the exact same thing as medial umbilical ligament. It's that part of the umbilical artery that essentially degenerates into this non-usable ligament. Okay, somewhere on one of the handouts you guys have in lab, it says something about the obliterated umbilical artery and then not being able to see the medial and umbilical ligament. I have no idea what that's about. They're both the same thing. But the important thing to remember here is that that umbilical artery is still a functioning artery until it turns into this medial umbilical ligament, and I tell you that because it gives off this artery right here. And that, of course, is my superior vesicle. And you guys should know by now in lab that vesicle refers to bladder. And you can see it, of course, coming down and supplying, there's my bladder, and supplying the bladder for us. So vesicle refers to bladder. Don't confuse that with vesicular as far as the seminal vesicles with the boys, okay? So superior vesicle supplies the bladder. And then we have the next one coming off of our, so if we work our way down, the next one coming directly off the internal iliac artery is going to be our obturator. So you can see that puppy right there. I'll just draw a line to it. And what you should notice about the obturator artery is that it essentially follows the same path as the obturator nerve. I believe in lab you may have the obturator artery on at least one of those bodies arising from the external iliac artery, which is over here. That's this sucker over here. Not that uncommon. It kind of comes off and then it goes kind of in the same direction like that. It's kind of one of those common, uncommon things to happen, so don't, be alarmed that if you have that coming off. What you're going to do is look for to see that it goes to the same place as that obturator nerve, out through the obturator foramen. Again, working our way down, and the next vessel we're going to have come directly off of our internal iliac is this one right here, and that, of course, is going to be our inferior vesicle. And the interesting thing about the inferior vesicle, that's going to supply the fundus of the bladder as well as the inferior part of the bladder. And the one kind of extra thing you have to remember there is that in males, what do we have that's directly beneath the bladder? Well, of course, we have the prostate. We also have the seminal vesicles there. So in males, the inferior vesical artery can also supply the prostate and the seminal vesicles. They got to be supplied by something, right? So the next one we have coming off of, if we work our way down, here's our internal iliac, still just kind of working our way down, Next one we have coming off is this one right here. And this is our middle rectal artery, and obviously it's going to supply exactly as it sounds, supplying the middle portion of the rectum. Might be a bit confusing because I believe on this picture that would be the right middle rectal. Okay, so the left middle rectals you'll actually be able to see. We'll see those in another slide coming over in this area on the other side of the rectum, but we're going to kind of ignore those right now and just focus on this. You can see the middle rectal comes directly off the internal iliac, and obviously it supplies the rectum. In males, again, that can also supply the seminal vesicle and the prostate. We're going to come back to middle rectal in just a bit. You have internal pudendal, which is actually this bad boy right down here. So there is my internal pudendal artery, and we already know that the pudendal nerve supplies the perineum and the genitalia, and likewise the internal pudendal artery is going to supply the perineum and the external genitalia in males and females as well. Inferior gluteal artery, of course, is not shown in this picture, but we already know that supplies the muscles of the gluteal region. This is one that's highly variable. It can come off of this anterior division. It can also come off of the posterior division. So, you know, don't freak out if it's coming off of either or. Either way, it comes off of the internal iliac directly. So that's basically most of the ones that come off of the internal iliac in males and females. There's a couple extra that come off in females. Some books will tell you, and even some TAs, that females do not have an inferior vesical artery, that in females the vaginal artery is kind of essentially the inferior vesicle. It really just kind of depends on the text. You know, I prefer to go with that females do have the inferior vesical artery. They just usually arise from, in females, the vaginal artery. So just to have you be aware of that. If we look here at this other slide, you can see this internal pudendal artery here. I just want to make note of the pathway of that. There it is right there, and you can see that you have some other vessels coming off of it, but if you follow it down you can see it's actually going to be supplying the external genitalia in men, the the scrotum, the penis. So it's very important in males, and you can see it's also quite important in females. There's the internal pudendal artery, and you can see that it sends off branches to the labia, it sends off branches to some erectile tissue, and it sends off branches to the clitoris. So it's a very important artery in both males and females. Now, if we go to females real quick, we obviously know that guys don't have a uterine artery and a vaginal artery, so you're only going to see this on females. And we would look here, this right here is going to be my uterine artery, comes directly excuse me, comes directly off of the internal iliac, and this one over here is going to be my vaginal artery. Again, can come directly off the internal iliac, or probably most often it comes off of the uterine artery itself. I would take either answer on it, but the important thing is that it's going to be supplying the vagina, and we know that the vagina is going to be inferior to the uterus. So you can see that these areas here, of course, highly vascularized areas, which of course makes sense. Okay, so again, you're not going to have a uterine and a vaginal artery in men. Hopefully I don't have to really remind you that too much. So we already